The explosion didn't knock Ethan Drake off his feet. It knocked him back to life. 37 years old, invisible in a faded gray uniform, pushing a mop through marble corridors while billionaires argued about quarterly projections above him. And in the span of 4 seconds, the carefully constructed anonymity he'd spent years building dissolved inside a column of fire and screaming metal. Somewhere above him, 30 floors up, a woman was trapped in a steel box filling with smoke. And somewhere in the same building, a man who had planned every second of this disaster was watching it unfold on a private monitor, confident that nobody inside Ashford Tower could stop what he had set in motion. He didn't know about the janitor. Nobody ever did. If a story about an ordinary man hiding an extraordinary past inside a burning skyscraper is something you want to follow all the way through, hit subscribe right now and turn on notifications so you never miss the next chapter. Drop a like on this video and tell me in the comments what city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's go. The blizzard arrived without apology. By 9:17 on a Thursday night in late January, Denver had already received 14 inches of snow, and the Weather Service was forecasting another 8 before sunrise. The kind of storm that shut highways, grounded flights, and turned the city's grid of streets into something resembling a battlefield, empty, disorienting, hostile to movement in any direction. Inside Ashford Tower, the 42-story glass and steel headquarters of Ashford Capital Group, the weather outside was someone else's problem. The building was warm, bright, and fully occupied despite the hour. An emergency board presentation had been scheduled for 10 p.m., unusual by any measure, but Victoria Ashford didn't schedule things for convenient hours. She scheduled them when she was ready, and at 30 years old, she had already spent enough time inside this company watching convenient hours produce inconvenient results. Ethan Drake heard her name mentioned 3 times in the first hour of his shift without anyone actually speaking to him directly. That was normal. He'd been working nights at Ashford Tower for 14 months. In that time, he had learned the rhythms of the building the way he had once learned the rhythms of forward operating bases. The sounds that meant routine, the sounds that meant something was off, the particular silence that preceded a situation requiring immediate attention. He knew which elevator cables groaned unnecessarily on cold nights. He knew the sub-basement ventilation fans cycled in a pattern that sounded, if you didn't know the building, like a fault in the electrical system. He knew the service stairwell on the north side ran about 4 degrees warmer than the specs said it should, because someone had installed the insulation backward during a renovation 7 years ago, and nobody had ever bothered to fix it. He knew these things because he had made it his business to know them. Not out of professional dedication to custodial work, though he did the job without complaint and without cutting corners, because that was how he did everything. He knew the building because knowing the building was the closest thing he still had to the professional habit of keeping himself and the people around him alive. Old instincts don't retire just because you do. At 9:22, he was on the 14th floor replacing burned-out fluorescents in the south corridor when the first thing happened that wasn't normal. The building's PA system emitted a short, high-pitched tone, not the standard chime that preceded announcements, but something sharper, almost electronic, like a signal testing a frequency. It lasted maybe 2 seconds and stopped. Nobody on the floor reacted. The handful of analysts still at their desks at that hour were buried in their screens and probably hadn't even registered it consciously. Ethan registered it. He set down the replacement bulb he was holding and stood very still for a moment, listening. Nothing followed. The floor hummed with its normal ambient noise, climate control, distant keyboard clicks, the muffled bass of the blizzard pressing against the glass. He went back to work. At 9:31, the lights on floors 22 through 26 went out simultaneously. Not flickering, not dimming. Off, sudden and total, the way power cuts when something severs a circuit rather than fails one. The building's backup lighting activated within seconds, painting those floors in the flat, amber glow of emergency strips along the baseboard. Ethan heard the overhead PA click on, and a facilities coordinator named Marcus, whose voice he recognized from weekly maintenance briefings, said, in a tone just slightly too controlled, "We're showing a temporary grid interruption on floors 22 through 26. Backup systems are active. Engineering is assessing. Please remain at your workstations." Ethan was already moving, not running. That would draw attention, and he had spent 14 months being invisible inside this building on purpose. He walked at the steady, purposeful pace of a man who had somewhere to be, which was always true and never looked suspicious. He took the service elevator to the sub-basement. The building's engineering corps lived there, a long, low-ceilinged room that smelled of machine oil and recycled air, lined with control panels, junction boxes, server racks, and the kind of industrial equipment that most of the people working 40 floors above had never thought about once in their careers. It was Ethan's territory, in the way that nobody else's territory overlapped with it. He pushed through the door at 9:34 and stopped. Dale Pritchard, the night facilities manager, was standing at the main monitoring console with his back to the door, talking on his radio in a low, urgent voice. Dale was 53, a decade past caring deeply about most things, and the expression on his face when he turned around was the particular face of a man who has just understood that the evening is going to be considerably worse than he anticipated. "Drake," Dale said, and then stopped as if he hadn't actually decided what to say next. "What are we looking at?" Ethan asked. "Grid issue. Something pulled power from 5 floors simultaneously, and I can't isolate where it sourced." Dale turned back to the console. "Probably the storm. Ice on the—" "It's not the storm." Dale looked at him. "How do you—" "The storm's been running for 4 hours. If it was going to pull external power, it would have done it by now." Ethan moved to the console beside Dale and looked at the readout. These floors dropped at exactly the same second. External weather events don't hit multiple independent circuits at exactly the same second. Dale stared at the screen. "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying something tripped them deliberately." Ethan studied the readout. "And I'm saying whatever did it is still inside the building's systems." Dale started to say something about calling the electrical contractor when the second thing happened. The explosion was on the 31st floor. Ethan felt it before he heard it. A deep concussive vibration that moved through the building's skeleton, through the concrete floor, up through the soles of his shoes, and into his bones in the specific way that explosions travel through structures, which is different from any other kind of vibration, and which, once you've felt it enough times, your body learns to identify without any input from your conscious mind. Dale said, "What the—" The fire alarm activated. Every panel on the monitoring console lit up at once. Dale grabbed his radio and started talking fast, and Ethan stepped back from the console and thought for exactly 3 seconds. He thought, simultaneous circuit disruption across non-adjacent floors. Deliberate timing. Now a contained explosion on floor 31. Not random. He thought, somebody planned this. He thought, Victoria Ashford's board presentation is on floor 32. He was already moving toward the service stairwell. The 32nd floor was chaos wearing expensive clothes. Ethan came up through the maintenance access door at the east end of the corridor and walked into a scene that looked, in his assessment, like what happened when people who had spent their professional lives managing hypothetical risk suddenly encountered actual risk and discovered the two experiences had very little in common. Executives in tailored suits were clustered near the elevator banks. 2 men in dark security uniforms, the private detail Victoria traveled with, were talking into earpieces and looking at each other with the particular expression of people whose communications had just stopped working. A woman in her 40s, who Ethan recognized as the company's general counsel, was on her phone saying, "I need emergency services. We have—" and then stopping and saying, "Hello? Hello?" The building's cell signal was dead. Ethan stood at the edge of the corridor and took inventory. Smoke. It was coming from the elevator bank, thin, gray-white, seeping around the edges of the doors on the center bank of 3 elevators. Not thick enough yet to obscure vision, but with a particular chemical smell underneath the burn that he identified in about 2 seconds as the same accelerant compound he'd encountered in a port facility in Djibouti in 2019, which meant it wasn't a structural fire and it wasn't an accident, and whoever had placed it knew enough about building systems to target the elevator mechanicals specifically. That was important. You target elevator mechanicals when you want to trap people at altitude. He scanned the room and found Victoria Ashford in approximately 4 seconds because she was the only person in it who wasn't visibly panicking. She was standing near the window at the far end of the corridor with her arms crossed and her jaw set, watching the smoke with an expression of focused, cold attention. She was shorter than he'd expected from the photographs, maybe 5'4", with dark hair pulled back in a way that looked like it had started the evening as something more deliberate and had migrated toward functional over the course of a long night. She was wearing the kind of suit that probably cost more than a month of his salary and she had taken off her heels and was holding them in one hand, which told him she'd already done a practical calculation about mobility. Smart. He noted it. The head of her security detail, a broad-shouldered man named Carlyle, whom Ethan had seen in the lobby dozens of times without ever exchanging a word, was now raising his voice at a facilities coordinator near the stairwell door. "I need those stairwell doors open now," Carlyle was saying. "Override the lock, whatever you have to." "Sir, the override requires—" "I don't care what it requires. That is my client in there, and I need—" "North stairwell is the wrong exit," Ethan said. Carlyle stopped talking. He looked at Ethan the way people tend to look at the custodian who interrupts the security chief, with a brief, reflexive contempt that he didn't bother to conceal. "Excuse me?" "North stairwell," Ethan said, and he kept his voice level and his posture relaxed and his hands visible, because he'd learned long ago that the way you present information in a crisis determines whether people hear it or dismiss it. The explosion was on 31, directly below us. If it targeted the elevator mechanicals, there's a better-than-average chance the north stairwell shaft is compromised. The infrastructure runs adjacent. You push 15 people into a stairwell with compromised integrity in a blizzard, you're trading one problem for a worse one. Carlyle stared at him. "Who are you?" "Night custodial." Ethan held up his badge. "I know the building." "I'm not taking evacuation advice from Marcus," Victoria Ashford said. Her voice was quiet. It didn't need volume. Something in the quality of it, steady, precise, accustomed to being the last word, made Carlyle stop mid-sentence. "Let him finish," she said. Carlyle turned to look at her. A complicated series of expressions moved across his face and resolved into something tight and controlled. He turned back to Ethan. "Fine, finish." "South maintenance stairwell, opposite end of the floor," Ethan said. "Separate infrastructure shaft runs along the exterior wall. Fire-rated doors, independent ventilation. It's not on the standard evacuation map because it's a service route, but it's rated for full-floor occupancy, and it's clear." "How do you know it's clear?" "I was in it 40 minutes ago." Silence. Somewhere below them, something metallic groaned. The building's skeleton registering stress that Ethan didn't like the sound of. "Get everyone to the south end of the floor," he said. "Now, please, before the smoke gets worse." Victoria was already moving. "You heard him," she said to no one in particular and everyone simultaneously. "South end, let's go." It was interesting, Ethan thought, watching people begin to move. The way a single decisive voice in the right moment could redirect 20 people who had been paralyzed 30 seconds earlier. He'd seen it work on riverbanks in Helmand Province and in blown-out vehicle pools in the Sahel and in a burning forward operating base outside Mosul, and the mechanism was always the same. Panic was contagious, and so was calm, and whoever projected calm first with enough authority behind it tended to set the tone. Victoria Ashford projected calm the way some people project noise, not by effort, but by default. He filed that away. He was moving against the flow of people now toward the elevator bank, because there was something he needed to check. The smoke was thicker here, closer to the doors, and he crouched low and put his hand against the metal of the center elevator door and felt the heat behind it. Then he heard something that stopped everything else in his mind. A voice, muffled behind the metal from inside the elevator shaft, not from the floor above or below, but from the car itself, which meant someone was inside the elevator, between floors, and the car had stopped when the mechanicals were hit. He pressed his ear to the door. "Tried the emergency phone. It's dead. I can't—" A pause. Coughing. "Is anyone out there? Hello?" Male voice, young, scared, but not yet losing it, which meant he still had some time. But the smoke seeping around those doors was going somewhere, and part of it was going into the shaft. Ethan stood up and turned back toward the corridor where Carlyle was moving the last of the executives toward the south stairwell. "There's someone in the center elevator," he said. "Cars stopped between floors. We need the manual release." Carlyle turned. "Building maintenance handles." "I am building maintenance." Ethan said it without heat. "I need access to the elevator machine room on the mechanical floor. Do you have a master key, or do I need to go back down for mine?" Another pause. The two men looked at each other across 20 feet of smoke-hazed corridor, and something shifted in Carlyle's expression. Not warmth, not trust, but a reluctant recalibration. "I'll get you the key," Carlyle said. The man in the elevator was 24 years old, an analyst named Kevin Park, who had stayed late to finish a model for the morning and had been riding down to grab coffee from the lobby when the explosion hit and the car dropped 18 inches and stopped. He was sitting in the corner of the car with his laptop clutched to his chest when Ethan manually cranked the doors open and the thin emergency light from the corridor cut through the gray haze inside the shaft. Kevin looked up, saw the faded uniform, said, "Oh, thank God," and then caught himself and said, "Sorry, are you maintenance?" "Yeah," Ethan said. "Can you walk?" Yes, I'm fine. Yes." "Then let's go." Kevin scrambled out of the car, dropped about 14 inches to the corridor floor, stumbled, and Ethan caught his arm without comment. "Which way?" Kevin said, looking at the smoke. "South." They moved. Behind them, somewhere in the building's infrastructure, in the conduits and shafts and sealed spaces that existed between floors, in the hidden architecture of a 42-story tower that most of the people inside it had never thought about, something was still burning. And Ethan Drake, pushing a rescued analyst down a smoke-hazed corridor toward a maintenance stairwell that wasn't on any standard evacuation map, was running the calculations that nobody else in the building had the experience to run. Simultaneous circuit disruption, targeted explosion, elevator sabotage, communications dead. He knew what those things added up to. He just didn't know yet how many more components were still waiting to be triggered, or by whom, or from where, or whether there was enough time to find out before the next piece of the plan revealed itself. What he knew was this: the building had been turned into a trap, and someone had been counting on the fact that none of the people inside it would know how to navigate one. They were mostly right. Mostly. The south maintenance stairwell smelled like cold concrete and old metal, and it was the best smell Ethan Drake had encountered all evening. He counted heads as people filed through the fire door. 16 executives, 3 assistants, 2 members of Carlyle's security team, Kevin Park still clutching his laptop like it contained something worth dying for. The stairwell lighting was functional, the air was clean, and the structural integrity felt solid underfoot, which meant his read on the infrastructure separation had been correct. Small mercies. Carlyle positioned himself at the door, watching the corridor behind them. He was professional enough, Ethan could see that. The man knew how to move people and how to hold a position. What he didn't know was the building, and in a situation like this one, the building was the whole game. "How far down are we going?" Carlyle asked. "Not down," Ethan said. Carlyle looked at him. "The exit is down. The lobby is down. The lobby has 3 access points that feed directly from the parking structure and the street-level service bays." Ethan kept his voice low, because the last thing this stairwell needed was 16 people hearing the words that were about to come out of his mouth and processing them at full volume. If this was planned, and it was planned, then whoever did it accounted for standard evacuation routes. Ground floor is where you funnel people if you want to control what happens to them next. Carlyle stared at him for a long moment. In the flat emergency lighting, his face was all sharp shadows. "You're saying this isn't over." "I'm saying I don't think it's close to over." A beat. Then, "Where are we going?" 8, Ethan said. "There's a freight loading corridor on 8 that connects to the east parking structure through a service tunnel. The tunnel exits onto Champa Street, which is upwind of whatever is burning and outside the building's footprint." He paused. "It's not on any map that your team would have been briefed on. Because it's a maintenance route. Because it was sealed off during the 2019 renovation and facilities never updated the public schematics. It's still passable. I used it 3 weeks ago to move HVAC equipment." Carlyle processed this. Whatever calculation he was running, it ended with a short nod. "Lead the way." Ethan moved to the front of the group and started down. Victoria fell into step about 4 paces behind him, which he noticed because she was moving deliberately. Not just following the group, but positioning herself close enough to hear him and Carlyle talk. He'd seen that behavior in field commanders who didn't trust secondhand information. He found he didn't mind it. They were on the 14th landing when she said quietly, "How did you know the north stairwell was compromised?" He kept moving. "The explosion on 31 was in the northwest mechanical space. The north stairwell infrastructure runs through the same structural bay." "You knew that off the top of your head." I've been in this building for over a year. Most people who work in a building for a year couldn't tell you which mechanical bay is adjacent to which stairwell shaft. He didn't answer that. She didn't push it, but he could feel her attention. The way you feel a change in air pressure, something present and assessing, not hostile, just very awake. They reached the 8th floor at 9:57. Ethan held the stairwell door and counted people through into the freight corridor, a long utilitarian passage with exposed conduit along the ceiling and rubber flooring that had seen better decades. Emergency strips gave enough light to move by. The group compressed into the corridor and Ethan let the door shut behind him. "Keep moving," he said. "Single file, stay close to the wall on the right. There's a junction about 60 meters ahead. We go left." He was 12 meters into this corridor when his radio, the facilities band, not the building's main comm system, crackled. It was Dale Pritchard's voice, and it sounded wrong in the specific way that voices sound wrong when the person speaking them is trying to remain calm about something that is not calm. "Drake, you there?" He pulled the radio. "Here." "What?" "I've got something bad on the panel down here." A pause filled with static. "The ventilation system. Someone flipped the return air handling on floors 10 through 25. Drake, it's pulling smoke up through the building instead of exhausting it, and I can't override it from down here. The override terminal's been physically disconnected." Ethan stopped walking. The person behind him, one of the assistants, a young woman in a green dress who'd been moving on pure adrenaline since the alarm, walked into his back and said, "Oh, sorry, It's fine," he said. He keyed the radio. "Is the sub-basement clear?" "For now. But if the ventilation keeps pulling like this, smoke concentration on the middle floors is going to hit dangerous levels inside of 20 minutes. Where's the manual override for the air handling?" "Mechanical room on 11. But Drake, I know." He clipped the radio back. 11 was inside the smoke concentration zone. Of course it was. He turned around and found Carlisle right behind him. "Problem," Carlisle said. It wasn't a question. "Building's ventilation has been reversed. Someone physically disabled the sub-basement override." He watched Carlisle's expression process that and arrive at the same place he'd arrived. "It's not a malfunction. Someone who knows this building's systems got into the infrastructure before the explosion and set this up." Carlisle was quiet for a moment. Then, very carefully, he said, "An inside job." "Has to be. You can't access the air handling override terminal without a facilities master key, and the junction is in a locked mechanical space." Ethan glanced at the group behind them. 16 people trying not to look as frightened as they were. He lowered his voice. "I need to go to 11. I need the manual override or the smoke situation gets a lot worse for anyone still on the upper floors." "There are people still on the upper floors?" "Building had over 200 employees tonight. We have 19. He let that number land. "I need to go up." Carlisle looked at him steadily. "You're the night janitor." "I'm also the only person in this building right now who knows where the mechanical room on 11 is and how to get into it without triggering the secondary lock." He held Carlisle's gaze. "Get them to the Champa Street exit. 60 meters, left at the junction, follow the yellow hazard stripe on the floor. You can't miss it. And if you don't come back, then you get them out anyway." He was already turning when Victoria's voice stopped him. "I'm coming with you." He turned back. She was standing at the front of the group with her heels still in her hand and an expression that wasn't asking permission. "No," he said. "I know the building's security override codes," she said. "All of them, including the mechanical room on 11, which has a secondary electronic lock in addition to whatever key you have. You'll hit that door and be stuck without the code." He looked at her. She looked back. She wasn't bluffing, he could see that. And she was right. The mechanical rooms above the 8th floor had been upgraded to dual lock during the 2022 security renovation, and he had the physical key but not the electronic code. And the electronic code would be exactly the kind of thing a CEO would have and a night janitor would not. He said, "Can you move fast?" "I took off my heels 20 minutes ago." "Yes." He turned to Carlisle. "Get them out." Carlisle looked at Victoria. Something passed between them, employer and employee, or something more complicated than that, some accumulated weight of previous moments that Ethan wasn't privy to. Whatever it was, Carlisle gave a short nod. "Don't get her killed," he said to Ethan. "Working on it," Ethan said, and he pushed back through the stairwell door with Victoria Ashford 3 steps behind him. The smoke on 11 was thin enough to see through, but present enough to taste, acrid, chemical, with that underlying accelerant smell that kept confirming what Ethan already knew. They moved fast through the corridor, Victoria matching his pace without complaint, and he registered with some detached part of his mind that she ran like someone who ran regularly, not like someone performing effort. The mechanical room was at the northeast corner of the floor. The door was gray steel with a card reader beside the handle. He had his key out before they reached it. "Code," he said. She stepped up beside him, punched 7 digits into the reader, and the light went green. He had the key in the cylinder before the light finished changing and pushed through. The mechanical room was about the size of a tennis court, all ductwork and control panels, and the constant low roar of air handling equipment moving tonnage of air through the building's circulation system. The smell in here was stronger, the chemical compound coming in through the return ducts, which meant the reversal was active and pulling. He found the manual override panel on the east wall and opened the housing. "You know what you're doing in there?" Victoria said from beside him. "Yes." He studied the array. "Give me 90 seconds. She gave him 90 seconds. He used 85 of them to identify the reversed return circuits, manually kill the reversal sequence, and restore the standard exhaust configuration. The change in the equipment noise was immediate. A shift in pitch as the system stopped pulling and started pushing, redirecting the smoke accumulation toward the roof exhausts instead of circulating it through the occupied floors. "Done," he said. "That fast." It wasn't complicated once you're looking at the right panel. She was watching him with that same focused attention she'd had in the corridor upstairs, and this time she said what was behind it. "You've been in a burning building before." He closed the panel housing. "Lot of buildings." "That's not an answer." "I know." He turned toward the door. "We need to move. The smoke's clearing, but this floor's not safe to stand around in." "Mr. Drake." "Ethan." "Ethan." She said his name the way people say a name when they're using it to make you stop and look at them. He stopped and looked at her. She had soot on her left cheekbone, and the professional composure was fully intact in a way that cost her something. He could see the cost of it, the effort underneath. "There are people in this building who are counting on whoever is running this rescue knowing what they're doing. I need to know what I'm working with." He looked at her for a moment. The equipment roared around them. "Former military," he said. "Long time ago. I know building systems, and I know crisis management, and I know how to read a situation that someone set up on purpose." He paused. "That's what I can tell you right now." She studied him. Then she nodded once, not satisfied, but willing to proceed on what she had. "All right," she said. "What's next?" What was next was this. His radio told him, as they descended back toward the freight corridor, that Dale had found something in the sub-basement monitoring that Ethan had been half expecting since the moment the first circuit dropped. The building's emergency communication system. The hardened internal network that was supposed to function independently of the main grid, the system that emergency responders would use to coordinate with anyone inside the building, was down. Not disrupted by the storm, not knocked out by the explosion. The diagnostic read as an active configuration change, meaning someone had reached into the system's settings and disabled it deliberately. No incoming emergency communications. No outgoing emergency communications. The building was sealed from the outside as thoroughly as it was sealed from the inside. Dale also said, "I've got a partial security feed from the 31st floor. Drake, the explosion wasn't accidental. Someone placed devices in the elevator mechanical room. I can see the cable management conduit on the feed, and it's not structural damage, it's placement damage. Someone put something there." Ethan said, "I know." "Who does something like this?" "Someone who wants something that's in this building." He was moving through the 8th floor freight corridor again, Victoria beside him, heading back toward the parking structure tunnel. "Or someone who wants to stop something from happening." He was thinking about the board presentation. 10 p.m., emergency session. The kind of meeting that only gets called late on a Thursday night in a blizzard when whatever is on the agenda can't wait for business hours. Victoria Ashford had scheduled that meeting, and she hadn't told him why. She had no reason to tell the night janitor why. But the timing of the attack, the specific targeting of the building's communications and evacuation systems, the fact that the fire had been placed to trap rather than destroy, all of it pointed toward a single operational objective. Stop the meeting. Not just disrupt it. Stop it so completely that whatever was supposed to be presented couldn't be presented, and anyone who might testify to what they'd seen or heard was either dead or too consumed with survival to follow through. He filed that conclusion and kept moving. They got back to the freight corridor junction and found it empty. Carlyle had moved the group, which was what Ethan had told him to do, which was good. The yellow hazard stripe ran left toward the service tunnel. He turned right. "The exit is left," Victoria said. "I know." He kept moving. "There are 180-some people in this building I haven't accounted for yet." She fell into step beside him without further argument. What followed was the next 2 hours of Ethan Drake's life, and later, when he tried to reconstruct them in sequence, they came back to him in pieces rather than as a continuous narrative. That was how crisis time always worked in his experience. Not a smooth film, but a series of sharp images, each one oversaturated with detail. The accounting team on the 17th floor, 11 people who had sheltered in a conference room and barricaded the door because smoke had been visible in the corridor and nobody had known whether to trust the evacuation alarm or wait for instructions. He got them out through a maintenance access panel that connected to a parallel corridor that was clear of smoke, moving them single file with a woman named Patricia Ortega, 51, facilities manager, absolutely steady under pressure, acting as rear escort while he led from the front. The situation on the 23rd floor, a group of 8 who had tried to use the north stairwell and found the door jammed and had backtracked to an interior conference room where the smoke was getting worse. He and Victoria reached them through the East Service corridor, which required going through a locked IT storage room and across a cable management walkway that was not designed for foot traffic, and announced that fact with every step. He got them moving toward the south stairwell, while Victoria called the roll of names she knew and confirmed everyone present. "How do you know all their names?" he said as they moved down the stairwell behind the 8. "I have 600 employees," she said. "I know most of their names." "Most." "I'm working on it." A pause. "I know every name on the night shift. There aren't many of you, and you're here because you need the work, and that matters." He didn't say anything to that. The hard one was the 28th floor. He heard it on the radio from Dale. 2 facilities workers had been in the building's main electrical room on 28 when the explosion hit, and the blast had buckled the door inward and jammed it in the frame. Both men were uninjured but trapped, and the electrical room was beginning to get smoke from the ventilation ducts above it because the reversal he'd corrected on 11 hadn't fully cleared the upper floor accumulation yet. 28 was high. The smoke on the upper floors was heavier. The north stairwell, which was the only stairwell that ran past the east electrical room access, was structurally questionable. He went anyway. Victoria came. He stopped arguing about that somewhere around the 17th floor. She wasn't reckless. She was measuring exactly the same risks he was and arriving at the same conclusion he was, which was that 2 people could do things one person couldn't, and that the people trapped on 28 needed them both there. The north stairwell showed its problems at floor 24. A section of the landing had separated slightly from the wall, not collapsed, but moved, and moving meant the integrity of the load path was compromised. He tested it with his weight before letting Victoria cross, and it held, but it held in the specific way that things hold when they're holding for the last time. "Fast," he said, and she crossed fast. The electrical room door on 28 took 7 minutes and a fire axe from the nearest emergency cabinet. One of the trapped facilities workers, a man named Gareth, who was built like he'd spent serious time in a gym and had apparently spent the trapped interval doing controlled breathing exercises, helped push from the inside once Ethan had worked enough of the frame loose to get purchase. The door came open. Gareth and his colleague Darnell emerged into the corridor coughing and looking like men who had genuinely considered the possibility that this wasn't going to end well for them. "Took you long enough," Gareth said. "Had a few stops," Ethan said. "Can you run?" "Right now I could run a marathon." "Good. South stairwell, all the way down, follow the yellow stripe in the freight corridor on 8 to Champa Street. Don't stop." They didn't stop. He and Victoria were last out of the 28th floor stairwell, and they were on the 14th landing when Ethan heard something that made him stop and put a hand on Victoria's arm. Below them, 3, maybe 4 floors. Footsteps. Moving up. Deliberate, careful, not the panicked movement of someone evacuating. Someone ascending in a building that was being evacuated. He put his finger to his lips. Victoria went still. The footsteps paused. then continued, slower. Ethan pulled Victoria back against the wall beside the stairwell door, out of the direct sightline of anyone coming up the center of the stairwell. He waited. The figure that came into view on the landing below was a man in a security uniform. Not Carlisle's team, different uniform. The building's contracted security service. He was holding a phone in one hand and looking at it, and he was moving with the specific kind of deliberation that Ethan associated with people following instructions rather than instincts. The man looked up, saw them, stopped. For a second, nobody moved. Then the man's free hand moved toward his hip, and Ethan was already moving. Down the stairs, closing the distance in 2 seconds. And what happened in the following 4 seconds was efficient and not gentle, and resulted in the man sitting against the stairwell wall with his wrist at an uncomfortable angle and the phone skittering across the landing. "Don't," Ethan said, quietly. He held the wrist with one hand and had his forearm across the man's collarbone, which was enough to make the physics very clear. "Who sent you up here?" The man said nothing. He was in his 30s, average build, scared but trying not to show it. "Building's being evacuated," Ethan said. "You're going the wrong direction. Why?" Still nothing. Ethan glanced at the phone on the landing. The screen was still active. He could see the last message thread. No name on the contact, just a number. And the most recent message read, "Confirm she's still on upper floors." She. He looked at the man against the wall. "You're not here to help people get out." The man's jaw was set. Whatever he'd signed up for tonight, he'd apparently signed up for it knowing he wasn't going to talk if something went wrong. Ethan recognized the posture, not trained professional, but paid professional, which was sometimes more rigid in its way. Victoria had come down the stairs behind him. He heard her pick up the phone. "I don't recognize this number," she said, "but I recognize the contract logo on his uniform." A pause. "That's Carlisle's firm, same company." Ethan looked at the man. "You're on Carlisle's team?" Something shifted in the man's face. Not confirmation, but not denial either. "How many are you?" Ethan said. Nothing. He made a decision. He looked at Victoria. "Give me your scarf." She had a silk scarf at her neck, decorative, probably expensive. She pulled it off without asking why and handed it to him. He used it to secure the man's wrist to the stair railing in a configuration that was firm but not injurious, and he pocketed the phone. "Somebody in that security team is working with whoever set this up," he said to Victoria, keeping his voice down. She was quiet for a moment. "Marcus Carlisle has been with me for 4 years. I'm not saying it's him. How many people are on his team tonight?" 6, including him. I've accounted for 2 others. They were with the group I sent to Champa Street. He thought about it. Which leaves 3 unaccounted for. She took that in. Her face did something complicated and then went smooth again. The professional composure resettling over whatever was actually happening underneath it. "Someone planned this from inside the building," she said. "Knew our systems, knew the communications, knew the evacuation routes." She paused. "Knew about the board meeting." "Yes." "The board meeting is about an internal audit," she said. "Financial irregularities in the capital allocation division. The kind of irregularities that, if the board receives the documentation tonight, trigger an automatic referral to federal regulators." Her voice was completely level. "The kind of irregularities that would expose someone to criminal prosecution." Ethan looked at her. "I've been building that case for 7 months," she said. 3 people outside my direct team knew the presentation was tonight. One of them is Adrian Wolf, our COO. She said the name the way you say a name when saying it out loud makes something real that you'd been hoping wasn't. Ethan didn't say "I'm sorry," because it wouldn't have helped anything. He said, "We need to get to Carlisle before whoever is still up here does." Agreed. She picked up her non-existent heels. She'd set them down on the landing at some point and apparently decided they were a permanent loss. "Let's go." They went down. The stairwell held all the way to 8, and the freight corridor was empty and clear, and the yellow hazard stripe on the floor led them toward Champa Street and the cold, dark air of a Denver blizzard. And Ethan Drake kept moving because moving was the only option available, and stopping was something he couldn't afford. Not yet. Not while there were still people inside. And not while the man who had engineered all of this was still somewhere in the building, watching his plan unfold, and still, as far as Ethan could tell, confident that the night was going to end the way he had designed it to. That confidence, Ethan had learned long ago, was the most dangerous thing about a man like that. And it was also, if you knew how to use it, the thing you could turn against him. The Champa Street exit opened onto a loading dock that had accumulated 8 inches of snow since the storm began, and the 41 people who had made it out of Ashford Tower in the preceding hour were pressed against the building's east exterior wall using the overhang for minimal shelter, which was not much shelter at all. Carlyle had done his job. Ethan could see it in the way the group was arranged. Not a frightened crowd, but something with structure, people organized by mobility and need. The less steady ones toward the interior, the more capable ones on the perimeter. Whatever else was true about Marcus Carlyle, the man knew how to manage a group under pressure. He turned when Ethan and Victoria came through the door, and the relief that crossed his face was immediate and unguarded, which told Ethan something about him that the preceding 2 hours hadn't confirmed one way or the other. A man who'd been part of the operation wouldn't have looked relieved. He'd have looked controlled. "You're both intact," Carlyle said. "So far," Ethan said. He pulled Carlyle 2 steps away from the group. "One of your people is still in the building. North Maintenance Stairwell, 14th Landing, secured to the railing. He was moving up through an evacuating building, and he had a communication thread on his phone asking for confirmation of Ms. Ashford's location. He said it flat and direct because there was no version of that information that softened on delivery." He watched Carlyle's face. What he saw wasn't guilt. What he saw was the specific expression of a man absorbing a piece of information that reconfigured something he'd believed to be true and not taking it well. "Which one?" Carlyle said. "I don't have a name." 30s, average build, scar above his left eyebrow. Carlyle was quiet for 3 seconds. "Renner," he said. Then, "Damn it." "You know him well?" 3 years. Recommended him myself." He exhaled. "Who's he talking to?" "Unknown number, but Ms. Ashford believes the operation connects to Adrian Wolfe." Ethan paused. "Does that name mean anything in the context of your team?" Carlyle looked at him steadily. "Wolfe's office contracted an independent security review 8 months ago. My firm was brought in. Renner was on the assessment team." He said it slowly, like a man hearing the mechanism click into place. He would have had access to the building's full security schematics, emergency systems, communication architecture. Victoria, who had been standing close enough to hear, said, "He helped design the vulnerabilities." "He helped identify them," Carlyle said, "and apparently passed everything he found to the wrong person." Ethan said, "How many of your people are unaccounted for?" 2 others, aside from Renner, Chen and Vasquez. I sent them back up to do a sweep of 32 when communications went down. I haven't heard from them since." "What floor were they last on?" 32. Maybe 33. Ethan looked up at the building. From the loading dock, through the snow and the dark, he could see light flickering in the upper floors. Not the amber of emergency strips, but something warmer and less steady. The fire on 31 had either been contained by the suppression system or had found something new to burn, and from this angle he couldn't tell which. He looked at his watch. 11:14. The blizzard had intensified in the last hour. The snow was horizontal now, driven by wind that had come up from the south and was doing nothing to help the temperature. Emergency vehicles would be somewhere on the far side of this storm, trying. They just weren't here yet. "I need to go back in," he said. Carlyle said, "You need to wait for fire department." "Fire department can't get through the storm, and we both know it." He kept his voice even. "There are at minimum 2 of your people on the upper floors, and I don't have a count on how many building staff are still unaccounted for. Dale's in the sub-basement. He's been coordinating from the monitoring console, and he might have better numbers." "Dale Pritchard is still inside?" "He stayed at the panel. He's the only reason we knew about the ventilation reversal in time to do something about it." Ethan looked at Carlyle. "I'm not waiting. You can argue about it, or you can tell me something useful." A long moment. Wind pushed a curtain of snow sideways across the loading dock, and the group against the wall shifted and pressed closer together. "Chen carries a secondary radio," Carlyle said. "Facilities band, channel 7. Same band you're on. I gave them to her as backup when our main comms went down." Ethan pulled his radio and switched to 7. Static. He said, "Chen, this is Drake, Night Facilities. You there?" Nothing for 4 seconds. Then breaking through the static with the specific compression of a signal bouncing off too many walls. "Drake." "Yes." "Who? How are you on this?" "Carlyle's people gave me the band. Where are you?" 33, East Corridor. We found something up here and we've got a situation. Her voice was controlled, but with something tight underneath it. There's a man up here. Civilian says he's building staff. He's been shot. The loading dock went quiet around Ethan, which was notable given the wind. How bad? He said. Shoulder. He's conscious, he's talking, but he's losing blood, and I don't have anything useful up here to work with. Vasquez is with him. A pause. Drake, there's something else. The man who shot him. He's still on this floor. We saw him. He went into the north corridor about 10 minutes ago, and he hasn't come out. Describe him. Tall, dark coat, moving like he owns the place. Victoria said it before Ethan could. That's Adrian Wolfe. He looked at her. 6'2", always wears a dark coat, she said. Her voice had gone very careful. He would know this building. He'd know where to be and where not to be. Ethan keyed the radio. Chen, secure your position. Barricade the door if you can. Do not engage the man in the north corridor. Stay away from him. I'm coming up. Copy, Chen said, and she didn't sound happy about the instruction to stay put, but she said it like she'd follow it. He turned to Carlyle. I need someone with me. Someone you trust without qualification. Carlyle looked at his remaining teams, 4 people, including 2 who'd been sheltering the civilian group for the past hour, and one who was the oldest member present and moving with a slight limp that suggested the evacuation hadn't been entirely kind to him. I'll come, Carlyle said. You need to stay with this group. Drake, someone tries to come out that exit who isn't one of ours. You need to be here. He held Carlyle's eyes. Your team needs a commander. It was the right word to use with the right man, and they both knew it. Carlyle pulled a key card from his jacket. This is a master access. Gets you through any electronic lock in the building. I have the override codes, Victoria said. This is faster than codes. She took it without argument. Ethan was moving back toward the door. Victoria was moving with him. He stopped. You're not... I know where Adrian Wolfe goes when he's cornered, she said. I've worked with him for 4 years. I know how he thinks. And you don't. She met his eyes. You need me. He looked at her for one honest second and decided she was right, and that arguing further was a waste of time neither of them had. Stay behind me, he said. Do exactly what I say, when I say it, without discussion. Agreed. I mean it. Not after a brief debate. Immediately. I heard you the first time, she said, and pushed through the door. The building received them back with the particular silence of a structure that has been through something and is still processing it. The freight corridor on 8 was clear, the air marginally better than it had been an hour ago. The ventilation correction was working, slowly. The stairwell was cold and smelled of concrete dust and something chemical that Ethan couldn't fully identify and didn't like. He set a fast pace. Victoria kept up without being asked. On the 19th landing, she said quietly, Can I ask you something? You can ask. In the freight corridor, when you dealt with Renner, that wasn't building maintenance training. He kept climbing. No. Military. Yes. What branch? He was quiet for a beat. Navy. For how long? 15 years. She absorbed that. And then you became a janitor. The way she said it, it wasn't contemptuous. It was genuinely trying to understand the distance between those 2 points. And then I became a father, he said. The janitor part was flexible. She didn't push further. He appreciated that. They came out on 33 into a corridor that was darker than the lower floors. The emergency strips here were operating at reduced capacity, probably a power fluctuation from whatever was still burning below. The darkness had texture to it, thick with recycled air and the distant sound of the storm against the glass exterior. He stopped in the doorway and listened. Nothing immediate. The floor felt empty in the particular way that floors feel empty when there are very few people on them, which is different from completely empty. Somewhere to the east, behind 2 sets of closed doors, were Chen and Vasquez and an injured man. Somewhere to the north, Adrian Wolfe. He moved toward east first. Chen had barricaded the conference room door with a credenza and 2 chairs, which was resourceful given the available materials. When she opened it after Ethan's knock, she looked exactly like what she was. A trained security professional who had been managing an impossible situation with inadequate resources and was very glad to not be doing it alone anymore. The injured man was a building engineer named Roy Castillo, 58 years old, who had been making a sweep of the floor's fire suppression panel when someone had come around a corner and put a bullet in him without apparent conversation. He was propped against the conference room wall with his jacket pressed against his shoulder and the specific gray pallor of a man who has lost more blood than is comfortable. He was conscious and he was angry, which in Ethan's experience was a good sign. "You're Drake," Roy said, looking at him. "Dale talks about you." "Dale has good taste," Ethan said. He crouched beside Roy and looked at the wound. Through and through, high shoulder, not arterial, painful and serious, and something Roy could survive if they got him out before infection became a consideration or blood loss crossed a threshold. "How long ago?" "Hour. Maybe hour and 10. Roy shifted and winced. "Man didn't say a word, just came around the corner and shot me. Never seen anything like that." "Did you see his face?" "Saw enough of it." Roy's jaw set. Tall, dark coat, looked like the kind of man who's used to people doing what he says. Victoria made a small sound. Ethan glanced at her. She was looking at Roy with an expression that was working very hard at being clinical and not quite getting there. "That's him," she said. Roy looked at her. His eyes widened slightly. "Ms. Ashford, I thought you'd gotten out." "Not yet." She crossed to him and crouched down. "Roy, I need you to hang on. We're getting you out of this building." "I'm not going anywhere particularly fast," Roy said, with the dry humor of a man who's decided that being grim about it won't help. "Vasquez," Ethan said. The other security officer, younger than Chen, compact and steady-looking, turned. "Can you carry him?" "Yes." "South stairwell. Same route as everyone else. All the way down, freight corridor on 8. Follow the yellow stripe to Champa Street. Carlisle is outside with the group." He looked at Roy. "This is going to hurt." "It already hurts," Roy said. "Fair enough." He helped Vasquez get Roy to his feet, which took a minute and was not graceful and involved Roy saying several words that he probably wouldn't have said in front of Victoria under normal circumstances. Once they were moving, Chen came to stand beside Ethan. "The north corridor," she said. He went into the server room. It's the big secured room at the end of the hall, whole floor's financial record storage. "How long ago?" 20 minutes, maybe more. He hasn't come out." Ethan thought about that. Server room, financial records. A man who had spent the evening trying to stop a board presentation about financial irregularities. "He's destroying evidence," Victoria said. She'd arrived at the same place a half-second ahead of him. "The physical records, the servers. If the digital audit trail gets corrupted and the physical backups are destroyed, your case collapses," Ethan said. 7 months of work." Her voice didn't crack, but the effort of keeping it from cracking was audible. "Every document, every transaction record, every communication log. We have copies in a federal depository, but the chain of custody requires the originals for the primary prosecution." "Then we go get them," Ethan said. Chen said, "He has a gun." "I know." "You don't have one." "I know that too." He turned toward the north corridor. "Wait here." "Drake," Chen started. "Wait here." He looked at Victoria. "You too." She opened her mouth. He held up one finger. "Server room access. What's the code?" A pause. 88441. "Thank you." He turned toward the corridor. He'd taken 4 steps when she fell into step beside him. He stopped. She stopped. They looked at each other. "I said, I heard what you said." She met his eyes. "But I know where the physical backup drives are in that room, and you don't. And Adrian Wolf, whatever else he is not going to shoot me in front of a witness." "You don't know that." "No," she said, "but I know him. And I know that he has always believed the thing that would stop him was a boardroom, not a burning building. His entire plan is premised on containing this legally, through chaos, not through violence." She paused. "Shooting me changes his entire exposure. He won't want to do it." "He shot Roy Castillo." "Roy is a witness he didn't expect. I'm the person he's been managing for months. Different calculation." It was sound reasoning. He didn't love it, but it was sound. "Behind me," he said. "And if I tell you to get down, you get down." "Yes," she said, and this time she didn't add anything to it. The north corridor was 70 feet of dark carpet and closed doors, and the server room was at the end of it, and there was light visible under the door. Not the emergency amber, but white. The room's own lighting, still functional on its dedicated circuit. He moved along the corridor wall, Victoria behind him and matching his pace, and he was listening for the sound of someone on the other side of that door and hearing nothing useful. 15 feet out, he held up a closed fist and she stopped. He held his position and counted to 10. Nothing from inside. He crossed to the door. The card reader beside it showed a steady red light. Locked. He held Carlyle's master key to the reader and it went green, and he went through fast and low, putting the door frame behind him and getting the room's geometry in the first second. It was a large room, climate-controlled to the point of being cold, with server racks on 3 walls and a central island of hardware that included the physical record storage system, a bank of drives and backup units that represented, apparently, 7 months of documented financial crime. Adrian Wolfe was at the central island with a device that Ethan recognized as a hardware degausser, a strong electromagnetic pulse generator that would scramble every drive in proximity. He was methodical about it, moving it along the rack in the specific way of a man following a plan he'd rehearsed. He was tall, dark coat, exactly as described, and he looked up when Ethan came through the door with the expression of a man who had expected interruption eventually and had decided in advance how he was going to handle it. He also had the gun. It was on the rack surface beside him, within reach. "Don't," Ethan said. Wolfe looked at him. Then he looked past him at Victoria, who had come through the door behind him. The expression on Wolfe's face when he saw Victoria was complicated. It wasn't guilt, or it wasn't only guilt. It was something that looked briefly like grief, which Ethan hadn't expected and which told him something about the man that the preceding hours hadn't. "Victoria," Wolfe said. "Adrian." Her voice was steady. "Put the degausser down." "You don't understand what you found in those records," he said. It wasn't supposed to go this far. The initial exposure was manageable. What you found was the containment, not the original problem." "I found $3 billion misallocated over 4 years," she said. "I found a way to survive a situation I inherited from the board members who hired me," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on the last 3 words, and Ethan adjusted his read of the man again. Not a predator in the pure sense. A man who had started managing something he couldn't control and had spent 4 years watching the management cost more than the original problem. If those records go to the regulators, people who had nothing to do with the original decisions go down with me. "That's what courts are for," Victoria said. "Courts." He said the word the way you say a word that means something to you that it doesn't mean to the person you're talking to. "I've watched what courts do to people who are adjacent to something they didn't choose." He looked at Ethan. "Who are you?" "Night custodial," Ethan said. Wolfe looked at him for a long moment. "No," he said. "You're not." "It doesn't matter who I am. The drive rack is done. Put the degausser down." 3 racks are already cleared." "Then those 3 are gone. The rest aren't." Ethan took a step forward. "And the gun on the rack there isn't an option you want to explore. I'm telling you that plainly. Because you're just a janitor. Because shooting me or her in a burning building ends every option you have left." Ethan kept his voice level. "Right now you're looking at financial charges. Securities fraud, misappropriation, maybe conspiracy. Your attorney can work with that. The moment you add shooting someone to the list, there's nothing to work with." Wolfe's hand moved toward the gun. And Ethan Drake stopped pretending. He crossed the remaining distance in the time it takes to cover 12 feet when you've spent 15 years moving fast through hostile environments. And what happened in the next 3 seconds was not complicated, and it was not graceful, and it involved Wolfe's gun hand being redirected at the critical moment, the gun going off once into the drop ceiling, and then the gun being on the floor 4 feet away while Wolfe was against the server rack trying to understand what had just happened. The whole thing took about as long as it takes to exhale. Wolfe looked at his hand, looked at Ethan, said, with something that was almost wonder underneath the pain, "What are you?" Victoria said, "He's the janitor." And then she crossed to the hardware island and picked up the degausser and pulled its power cell. And then she pulled a secondary drive unit from the lower rack, compact, protected, apparently the one she'd been thinking about when she said she knew where the backups were, and tucked it under her arm. Wolfe was looking at her now. "I didn't want anyone to get hurt." "Roy Castillo is going to have a very different memory of this evening," she said. Not viciously, just as a fact. Something went out of Wolf's face. Whatever argument he'd been assembling for himself about what kind of man he was, it went quiet. Ethan pulled a length of cable from the rack behind him and secured Wolf's hands, not brutally, but firmly and with the knot configuration of someone who had done that before. "Sit down," he said. "Stay sitting." Wolf sat. Ethan looked at Victoria. She was holding the drive unit and looking at Wolf with an expression that contained too many things to read cleanly. Anger, obviously, and something that looked like the residue of a trust that had been a long time building and a very short time destroying. "4 years," she said. "You managed my father's company for 4 years before I took over. I used to think you were the most competent person in the building." "I was," he said. And it wasn't arrogance, it was something that cost him to say. That's how it got this far. She looked at him for another second, then she turned away. "We need to get out of here," she said to Ethan. "We need to—" He stopped. His radio. Dale's voice, from the sub-basement, and Dale's voice now had the specific quality of a man who has been holding something back for 30 minutes and can no longer hold it. "Drake, I've been trying to reach you. I've got something critical on the panel. The fuel system for the backup generators, the main tank on sub-level 2. Someone's been venting it into the service tunnel network for the past hour, and I didn't catch it because the sensor was disabled, and I only saw it when I pulled the manual gauge." A pause. "Drake, the concentration in the tunnel system is... If there's any ignition source in those tunnels, the whole thing goes. Not just the building. The force of it would..." "How much time?" Ethan said. "I don't know. Could be minutes. The concentration level when I pulled the gauge was already in the critical range." He looked at Victoria. She had heard. She was looking at him with the specific expression of someone doing math and not liking the answer. "The Champa Street exit," she said. "The service tunnel. Runs directly through the fuel concentration zone," he said. "If anyone lights anything in that tunnel, Carlisle's group is outside. They got through. 20 minutes ago. The concentration's been building." He was already moving. "Wolf, get up." Wolf looked at him. "What?" "We're not leaving you in a building that might blow up. Get up." Something crossed Wolf's face that was hard to categorize. He got up. They moved. The stairwell down from 33 to the freight level took 4 minutes, which was fast with 3 people, including one with secured hands, and the whole way down. Ethan was running the problem of the fuel concentration and the service tunnel and the 41 people on Champa Street who were sheltering against a building exterior that was 2 walls and a corridor away from a potential catastrophic ignition event. He keyed the radio on the descent. "Carlisle." Static. Then, "Here. Move everyone away from the building, east on Champa, across the street, as far as you can get. Do it now." "What's—" "Do it now, Marcus." A beat. "Moving." They came out in the freight corridor. The air was heavier here than it had been. He could smell it now, the particular petroleum smell of diesel fuel vapor, faint but present, which meant the concentration had migrated further into the corridor network than Dale's gauge had shown. He stopped at the junction. The Champa Street exit was 60 meters left. The sub-basement access was behind them. "We can't take the service tunnel," he said. Victoria said, "What's the alternative?" He looked at the corridor, at the junction, at the ceiling with its exposed conduit and the old ductwork that ran alongside the freight corridor toward the east parking structure. "The parking structure has its own exit onto Curtis Street," he said. "North side. Access is through the vehicle gate, which is electronic." "The master key," she said, and held up Carlisle's card. "There's a pedestrian gate beside the vehicle entrance. Same system." He thought about the layout. "We go through the freight corridor to the parking structure connector. That's a hard-walled tunnel, concrete, separate from the service tunnel network. If the concentration doesn't extend that far, does it? I don't know." He said it honestly. "But the parking structure connector is the safest route we have." She nodded. "Lead." He led, with Victoria and Wolf behind him, and the corridor was quiet except for the sound of their feet on the rubber flooring and the distant bass of the blizzard somewhere above, and the faint, continuous alarm that had been running since 9:31 and had become the building's heartbeat. He was thinking about his daughter. Not in a sentimental way, not in the way people describe thinking about loved ones in danger, as a warming or clarifying influence. He was thinking about her practically, specifically. She was with Mrs. Kowalski 2 blocks from their apartment, and Mrs. Kowalski knew to keep her overnight if Ethan wasn't back by 11, and it was well past 11. She would be asleep in the spare bedroom with the blue quilt that she'd had since she was an infant, and she would not know that anything was wrong, and the only job he had, the only one that mattered more than anything else in the building around him, was to make sure she woke up in the morning still not knowing. He moved faster. The connector to the parking structure was a 100-meter concrete passage, and the smell of fuel vapor dropped off within the first 20 meters, which meant the concentration hadn't extended this far, and the risk level fell accordingly. He allowed himself one breath of something that was not quite relief, but was adjacent to it. They were 60 meters through the connector when the building, behind them and above them and all around them in its infrastructure, made a sound that Ethan Drake had heard before in other contexts and other countries, and would never, in the remainder of his life, be able to hear without his entire nervous system coming to full attention. It was the sound of a contained detonation finding something it could work with. The concussion hit the connector walls and moved through the concrete in a wave, and Ethan put one hand on the wall and kept moving, and behind him Wolf stumbled and Victoria caught his arm without breaking stride, and the lights in the connector flickered and held. Somewhere in the sub-basement service tunnel network, something had ignited. The parking structure gate was 50 meters ahead, and they ran for it, and Ethan was calculating the structural consequence of a fuel vapor explosion in the tunnel network on the connector they were standing in, which was adjacent but separate, which was the thing he was relying on, which was the thing he had no way to verify until the ceiling either held or it didn't. It held. They came out into the parking structure at a run, cold, dark, smelling of exhaust and winter, the blizzard audible through the ventilation gaps as a continuous howl. Ethan went straight to the pedestrian gate on the north wall, and Carlisle's keycard hit the reader, and the light went green, and the gate swung out into the storm. The cold was absolute and immediate, and the snow hit them like a physical thing, horizontal and sharp. He looked back. Victoria was there. Wolf was there, wrists still secured, blinking against the snow. He looked at the building. The explosion had been in the sub-basement. The upper floors of Ashford Tower were still standing, still lit in their emergency amber, the fire on 31 visible as a dull orange glow through the smoke that was pouring from the building's upper ventilation. The structure was intact. The concentrated detonation had gone through the tunnel network rather than up through the floors, which was the best outcome available. And the tunnel system connected, on its western end, to the abandoned service infrastructure beneath the adjacent block, which connected to, he said, Dale. Radio. Here. I'm here. It went in the tunnel, Drake, not the building. I'm intact down here, but there's structural movement, and I need to get to the sub-basement emergency exit, east wall, behind the main panel housing. There's a ladder access that goes up to the parking structure level. He turned back toward the gate. Go now. Copy, Dale said, and he sounded like a man who had been waiting for someone to give him that specific instruction for the past 20 minutes. Ethan looked at Curtis Street, which was buried under snow and empty of traffic, and looked, in the orange-lit blizzard dark, like a street in a city that had been evacuated. Somewhere south, he could hear sirens, finally, working their way through the storm, the first emergency responders reaching the perimeter of what Ashford Tower had become. Victoria was standing beside him, drive unit still under her arm, hair covered in snow, feet bare on the freezing pavement, and apparently not stopping to care about that. You're not wearing shoes, he said. I noticed, she said. He looked at her. She looked at him. And then, because there was nothing else available, she started laughing. Not the bright laughing of relief exactly, more the laughing of a person who has been operating at maximum capacity for 2 hours and has just discovered that the alternative to laughing is something they don't want to do in a parking structure in a blizzard. He didn't laugh, but the corner of his mouth moved in a way it hadn't moved in some time. Come on, he said, and led her toward the sirens. Behind them, Ashford Tower stood in the storm, damaged, scarred, still standing, and the 41 people on Champa Street were already across the street and safe, and Roy Castillo was going to make it, and Adrian Wolfe was walking between them in the snow, with his hand secured and his plan in pieces around him. And Ethan Drake was doing the thing he had told himself 4 years ago that he would never do again. He was still in command. Not because anyone had given it to him, because nobody else had known how to take it. He hadn't decided yet how he felt about that. The first fire truck reached Curtis Street at 11:41. Ethan watched it come through the storm from the parking structure entrance. The lights cutting orange through horizontal snow, the engine's sound arriving before the vehicle did, and then the truck itself materializing out of the blizzard like something from a different world entirely. Behind it came a second unit, then a third, and then two police cruisers with their own lights adding blue to the orange, and the whole intersection transformed in about 90 seconds from an empty snow-buried street into something that looked like the edge of a disaster zone, which was accurate. The first responders who reached them did so with the particular focused urgency of people who had been fighting through a blizzard for 40 minutes to get to an active fire and were now arriving to find a barefoot woman in a business suit, a man in a janitor's uniform, and a tall man in a dark coat with his hands secured behind him, standing outside a parking structure in 12-degree weather. The paramedic who reached Victoria first was a young woman named Torres, who took one look at the bare feet and immediately crouched down to assess for frostbite and said, "How long have you been out here without shoes?" "Not long," Victoria said. "There are people on the south side of the building on Champa Street who have been outside considerably longer, and a man with a gunshot wound to the shoulder who got out through the same exit. He needs to be your priority." Torres looked at her, then at Ethan. "Is she always like this?" "I just met her tonight," Ethan said. The next 20 minutes were controlled chaos of the specific variety that follows a crisis that isn't fully over. Fire crews going in on the lower floors to address what remained of the sub-basement explosion, and the 31st floor fire, paramedics triaging the Champa Street group that Carlisle had moved east and across the street. Police taking initial custody of Adrian Wolfe with the specific careful attention that people give a man who has clearly had a very bad night and is not yet done having it. Wolfe went without resistance. That was the thing Ethan noted. When the officers came to him and one of them said, "Sir, we're going to need you to come with us," Wolfe nodded once and walked with them. He didn't say anything, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who has run out of moves and knows it. He looked back once, at Victoria, before they put him in the cruiser. She looked back. Whatever passed between them in that moment was private in the way that things are private between people who have worked together for years, and one of them has just destroyed everything. Not public, not for interpretation, just two people looking at each other across the distance of a very specific kind of betrayal. Then the cruiser door closed and the snow came between them, and it was done. A detective named Brower found Ethan 40 minutes later sitting on the running board of one of the fire trucks with a thermal blanket around his shoulders, that he'd accepted mostly because refusing it would have taken energy he didn't have. Brower was in his 50s, unhurried, with the quality of someone who has seen enough crisis aftermath to know that the first version of events is rarely the complete version. He sat down on the running board beside Ethan, which was an unusual choice and probably deliberate, and opened a small notebook. "You're the night custodian," he said. "Yes." "Building records have you as Ethan Drake started 14 months ago." "That's right. Prior to that?" Ethan looked at the building. The fire crews had the lower floors under control. The glow on 31 was dimming, the smoke shifting from black to gray, which meant the suppressant was working. The structure was intact. He'd been watching it since they came out, and it was going to stand. "Military," he said. "Navy. I separated about 4 years ago." "Branch? Rate?" A pause. "Special operations." Brower wrote something. "Rank at separation?" "Commander." Brower didn't react to that with anything visible, which meant either he was very experienced or he'd already been briefed on something before he came to sit down. "Ms. Ashford's statement says you directed the evacuation of the building, coordinated rescue of multiple trapped employees, identified and corrected deliberate sabotage to the building's ventilation and emergency communication systems, subdued an armed individual on the 33rd floor." He looked at Ethan. "For a custodian." "I know the building," Ethan said. Brower held his gaze for a moment. Then he said, "Commander Drake, I'm going to be talking to a lot of people tonight, and for the next several weeks. I'm not going to push on the background right now, but I want you to know that whatever the full picture looks like, what I'm hearing from the people who came out of that building is consistent, and it points in one direction." He paused. "Anything you want to tell me voluntarily before this gets more formal?" Ethan thought about it. He thought about the sealed personnel file in a federal records system, the classified mission designation, The two caskets that had gone home from a country he was prohibited by his separation agreement from naming. He thought about his daughter asleep under the blue quilt, and the apartment with the second-hand furniture, and the 14 months of being invisible inside a building full of people who paid him no attention and in return gave him the closest thing to peace he'd found since coming home. He thought about all of that, and then he said, "I did what needed doing. That's all I want on record for now." Brower looked at him for another moment. Then he closed the notebook. "Get some sleep," he said, and stood up and walked away. Roy Castillo was airlifted to Denver General. The shoulder wound was serious but clean. The bullet had passed through without hitting bone, and the surgical team had him in recovery by 2 in the morning. His wife, who Ethan never met, apparently did not let go of his hand for the first 6 hours, according to Dale, who had a habit of reporting these things as if they were operational updates. Dale himself had made it up the parking structure ladder access 7 minutes before a section of the sub-basement ceiling came down, which was 7 minutes more than Dale would have had if Ethan hadn't told him where the ladder was. Dale reported this with the specific underreaction of a man who processes close calls by converting them into logistical data points rather than emotional events. And then he went home, and his wife, according to the text he sent Ethan 2 days later, made him sleep for 14 hours before she let him do anything else. Ethan left the scene at 1:15 in the morning after giving his initial statement to Brower and 2 additional officers and declining medical attention for a cut on his left forearm that he hadn't noticed acquiring and that stopped bleeding on its own before the paramedics had a chance to insist. He walked 6 blocks through the blizzard to his car, which had 8 inches of snow on it, and he sat in the driver's seat for a while without starting the engine. His hands were on the wheel, and he was looking through the windshield at the snow falling through the amber light of the street lamp above him, and he was thinking, with the particular exhausted clarity that follows sustained adrenaline, about what the next few days were going to look like. He'd given his name, he'd given his background. Brower hadn't pushed, but Brower was going to. And the case against Wolf was going to require testimony, multiple rounds of it, and his name was going to surface in that testimony, and the sealed file had a way of becoming less sealed when federal prosecutors started building cases that touched national security adjacent personnel. His phone buzzed. Unknown number, which would normally mean he let it go to voicemail, except that after the night he'd just had he picked up. "Mr. Drake," Victoria Ashford's voice. Formal, which surprised him, and then he registered that she was using it as cover for something else. The particular formality of a person who is still holding themselves together through structure. "I got your number from the emergency contact list in building records. I hope that's not inappropriate." "It's fine," he said. I didn't get a chance to say." She stopped, started again. "You saved my life tonight. Quite a few lives. And I understand you had reasons for maintaining a certain level of anonymity here, and I don't intend to disrupt that, but I couldn't let the night end without—" "It's all right," he said. "It's not all right," she said, with a firmness that surprised him. "Saying it's all right is how you dismiss what happened tonight, and I don't want to do that. What you did in that building it mattered. The people who went home tonight went home because of you. That's not something I'm going to reduce to, it's all right." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the snow fell through the amber light. "My daughter's 7, he said. He didn't know exactly why he said it, except that it seemed like the honest thing that was behind whatever he would have said if he'd had a better answer. "She doesn't know about any of it. The Navy, the missions. She knows I clean floors at night and I pick her up from school and I make pretty bad pancakes on Saturday mornings. That's my life now. That's what I was trying to protect when I took that job." A long silence on the other end. "I understand that," Victoria said. "I'm not going to take that from you." "The investigation is going to I know what the investigation is going to do," she said, "and I have attorneys and I have some degree of influence over what gets emphasized in the public record. I can't seal federal proceedings, but I can control a great deal of how this story gets told." A pause. "I want to. I want to control it in a way that lets you go back to picking up your daughter from school." He sat with that. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me. It's the least I can do." Another pause, longer. "Are you all right? Honestly." He thought about the question. His hands were still on the wheel. The cut on his forearm had dried to a dull ache. "I've had worse nights," he said. "That's either reassuring or deeply concerning." Probably both, he said. She made a small sound that was almost a laugh. Get some sleep, Ethan. You too. He sat in the car for another 10 minutes after she hung up. Then he started the engine, turned on the wipers, and drove through the blizzard to Mrs. Kowalski's apartment building, where he sat in the parking lot for 5 minutes before going upstairs and collecting his daughter, who was asleep and warm and who he carried the 4 blocks home through the snow without waking. He stood in her doorway for a while after he laid her down. Then he went to his own bed and stared at the ceiling for an hour before his body finally made the decision for him. That was the end of the first night. The second night was when everything changed, though it started quietly enough. 3 days after the fire, the blizzard had passed, the temperature had climbed to a civilized 28 degrees, and Denver looked like itself again under fresh snow. Ethan received a call from a number he recognized as Ashford Capital Group's main line. He was at the kitchen table drinking coffee and reviewing his daughter Sophie's school project on the water cycle, which she was required to present in 2 days, and which she had decided should include a hand-drawn diagram of every cloud type ever documented, an ambition that somewhat exceeded the assignment parameters. You don't have to draw all of them, he said before he answered the phone. Just cumulus and cumulonimbus, the teacher will be happy. But the others are real too, Sophie said without looking up from her drawing. He answered the phone. It was Victoria's assistant, asking if Mr. Drake would be available for a meeting the following morning. He said yes, and the assistant gave him an address that was not Ashford Tower, a temporary office suite in a building 3 blocks north, where the executive team had relocated while the tower was assessed and repaired. He spent some time that evening sitting with the question of what the meeting was about. He'd given his full formal statement to Brower and the federal investigators who had arrived on day 2 with considerably better suits and considerably less patience than the local detectives. He'd answered questions for 6 hours, carefully and completely, about the events inside the building. His military background had surfaced in those interviews with the inevitability he'd expected, and the investigators had taken it in with the specific, unsurprised quality of people who had already seen his file. He'd also, on day 2, received a call from a number he recognized immediately and hadn't heard in 4 years. The man on the other end hadn't given his name, and Ethan hadn't asked for it, and the conversation had been brief. The gist of it was that certain parties within certain federal structures were aware of Ethan's involvement in the Ashford Tower incident and were monitoring the situation, and that he should be aware that his service record remained classified at the original clearance level, and that this classification would be respected in any public proceedings to the fullest extent possible. He'd said thank you and hung up, and then he'd sat in the same chair he was sitting in now and thought about the way certain things follow you regardless of how deliberately you walk away from them. The meeting the next morning was in a conference room that was clearly temporary. Borrowed furniture, a folding table with a white cloth over it, coffee in a cardboard carrier from somewhere down the street. Victoria was there with 2 attorneys and a woman Ethan didn't recognize, who turned out to be the company's newly appointed interim COO. The attorneys explained the structure of the federal prosecution against Wolf, which was moving quickly given the volume of preserved evidence, and the associated internal investigation into what had been done to the company's capital allocation division over the preceding 4 years. They were thorough and professional and covered approximately 40 minutes of material. Then the attorneys stepped out, and Victoria poured more coffee into her cup and looked at Ethan across the table. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Of course." She held the cup in both hands. She looked, for the first time since he'd met her, tired. Not the acute tiredness of someone who has been through a fire, but the deeper tiredness of someone managing an enormous weight over a long period. 3 days of crisis aftermath had cost something that the night itself hadn't fully extracted. "I want to offer you something," she said, "and I want to be clear up front that you can say no without any consequence whatsoever to your current position or your status as a witness in the federal proceedings. This is entirely separate from all of that." "All right," he said. "The company is restructuring its security and emergency management protocols completely. What happened 3 nights ago exposed failures at every level of how we assess risk, manage crisis, and protect people inside our facilities." She paused. "I want to create a dedicated emergency response division, not contracted security, an internal team with real authority, real training, and real accountability. And I want you to build it." He looked at her. "Director of Emergency Operations," she said. "Full authority over the design and implementation of the program. You'd report directly to me, Salary is... She slid a piece of paper across the table. He looked at the number. He didn't react to it visibly, which was an effort. I've done some background, she said. I know what the Navy was. I know what the specific unit was, though I understand I can't formally acknowledge knowing. I know about the mission in 2019. She paused. And I know that whatever happened over there was not what the people responsible for you told you it was. He went still. That's not the basis for this offer, she said immediately. I'm not offering you this because I feel sympathy for what happened. I'm offering you this because I watched you operate inside a building that was trying to kill everyone in it, and I saw someone who knows how to keep people alive under conditions that would break most professionals. She held his gaze. That's what I need, and I think, for what it's worth, it might be what you need too. The silence in the temporary conference room was the kind that has weight. He thought about Sophie's school project. He thought about the water cycle diagram with too many cloud types, and the Saturday morning pancakes, and the way his daughter had started listing his job as building helper on the forms where her school asked what her parent did for work, because janitor was a word she'd learned got a certain reaction from the other kids, and she'd decided preemptively to circumnavigate that particular social geography on his behalf. He thought about the two men who hadn't come home from a country he still couldn't name. Martinez, who had been 26 and who had a younger sister he called every Sunday. Okafor, who had been 31 and who had been accepted to architecture school before the deployment and had deferred enrollment for one more tour and then had no more tours left to defer. He thought about the specific weight of the thing he'd spent 4 years putting down and had picked back up 3 nights ago without deciding to, just picked it up because it was there and people needed it and he was the one standing there. He said, I need to think about it. Of course. And I need to ask you something. Anything. The people in that building, he said, the ones who were still on the upper floors at 10 o'clock at night, the analysts and the support staff and the facilities people. Roy Castillo. He paused. They were there because the company runs a culture that rewards people for staying late and penalizes them, formally or informally, for not being visibly present at all hours. Victoria's expression shifted slightly. That culture, he said, is part of why the damage count was as high as it was. 200 people in a building at 10 p.m. is not an emergency response problem. It's a management problem that became an emergency response problem. He held her eyes. If I take this job, that changes. Not just the evacuation plans and the security protocols. The whole philosophy of how people are managed inside that building changes. I need your word on that. She was quiet for a long moment. You just told me the building I run contributed to the danger my employees were in, she said. Yes. And you're making that a condition of employment. Yes. She looked at him steadily. Whatever she was thinking, she kept it contained, but not in the way she kept things contained to avoid showing them. In the way she kept things contained because she was deciding something real and didn't want the decision to be performative. You have my word, she said. He nodded. Then I'll give you an answer by end of week. He gave it by end of the next day, which was not end of week, but was when his daughter asked him at dinner what he was thinking about, because he'd been quiet all through pasta, and she'd learned to read his quiet the way children learn to read the moods of the adults they depend on, which is to say with a completeness and accuracy that adults rarely manage in return. He said, work stuff. Is it important work stuff or boring work stuff? Important. Sophie considered this, twirling pasta around her fork with the inefficient but committed technique she'd been using for 2 years and refused to refine. Is it the building that was on fire? I saw it on the news. Mrs. Kowalski had the news on when you picked me up, and I saw the building, and it said Ashford something, and that's where you work. He hadn't lied to her. He hadn't told her much, but he hadn't lied. Yeah, he said. It is. Were you there? Yeah. She put down her fork and looked at him with the specific, direct scrutiny of a 7-year-old who has learned that grown-ups have a way of answering questions that sounds like an answer, but isn't. Were you scared? She said. He thought about that. He thought about the north stairwell landing and the fuel concentration in the service tunnel and the server room on 33. A little, he said. But you're okay. I'm okay. She picked up her fork. Okay, she said, apparently satisfied, and went back to the pasta. He watched her for a moment. Then he said, if I got a different job, one where I work during the day instead of nights, would that be okay with you? Sophie looked up, thought about it with genuine seriousness. Would you still pick me up from school? Yes. Okay, she said again, and then, what kind of job? Keeping people safe. She considered this. Like a firefighter? More like the person who makes sure the firefighters don't have to come as often. That sounds harder, she said. It might be, he said. She went back to her pasta. You should do it, she said, as if the matter was resolved, which in her estimation it apparently was. He called Victoria the following morning. 3 weeks later, Ethan Drake walked into the temporary Ashford Capital offices in a collared shirt and clean slacks that felt foreign in the specific way that clothes feel foreign when they belong to a version of yourself you're still getting used to. And he sat down with Victoria and the interim COO and 2 external consultants and began the work of designing something he'd never designed before. Not a mission, not an extraction plan, not a strategy for getting people out of somewhere they shouldn't have been. A structure for keeping people safe in the places where they had every right to be. It was different from anything he'd done in the Navy. It was also not entirely different. The first week was hard in the unglamorous way. Late nights over documents, building code assessments, security protocol reviews, conversations with fire marshals and risk management consultants and HR directors about the intersection of emergency response and workplace culture that got complicated fast. He made mistakes. He asked for things he shouldn't have asked for and had to walk them back. He missed a meeting because he'd scheduled Sophie's pediatric appointment in the same slot by accident and couldn't reschedule either one in time. And he sat in a waiting room for 45 minutes while his daughter got her annual checkup and sent apologetic emails on his phone and felt the acute discomfort of someone learning that the job he'd taken was not going to bend itself around the rest of his life. And neither was the rest of his life. And the negotiation between those 2 facts was going to be ongoing and imperfect, and there wasn't a system or a field manual that would resolve it. Victoria sent back, "Don't worry about the meeting, I have the notes. We'll talk tomorrow." And then after a pause, "How's the appointment going?" He sent back, "Fine, she's fine. She's reading a book about dolphins in the waiting room and ignoring me." Victoria sent a single period, which he'd come to understand in the preceding 3 weeks, meant she'd received the information and was processing it without comment. It was not, all things considered, a graceful beginning. But then the second week he sat down with the building engineering team and the facilities staff, the actual people who operated the building at ground level, the Dales and the Roys and the night shift workers, whose names most of the executive floors didn't know. And he spent 4 hours listening to them describe the gaps in the existing emergency protocols and the things that had never worked and the things they'd been told were fine and that weren't fine and that they'd stopped raising because raising them produced nothing. He listened without interrupting, which was harder than it sounded. Then he went back to his desk and wrote a 20-page assessment that was, insofar as such documents can be, honest. Not the kind of honest that protects everyone and therefore protects no one, but the kind that names what went wrong and why and what it would cost in time and money and institutional discomfort to fix it. He sent it to Victoria at 11 at night. She called him at 11:40. "This is going to upset a lot of people," she said. "Yes. The board is going to push back on the cost projections for the structural upgrades." "I know. And the HR section on after-hours culture is going to start a difficult conversation." "I know that too." A pause. "It's right," she said. "All of it is right. I just want you to know that I see what you've done here, and I intend to stand behind it." He was at his kitchen table, same chair as always, coffee going cold beside his laptop. Through the hall, he could hear the particular silence of a sleeping child, which was different from adult silence in a way he couldn't articulate, but that he could always identify. "I appreciate that," he said. "Ethan." She said his name the way she'd said it in the stairwell on the 24th floor, to make him stop and pay attention. "I know this isn't what you planned. 4 weeks ago, you were mopping floors and nobody knew your name, and that was exactly how you wanted it." "It was," he said. "Do you regret it, taking this?" He thought about the honest answer. He sat with it for a moment, the way you sit with things that don't resolve cleanly into yes or no. "Ask me in a year," he said. She was quiet for a moment, then, "Fair enough." After she hung up, he sat for a while longer. The building he was designing a safety program for was still being repaired 3 blocks away. The federal case against Adrian Wolfe was 3 weeks into discovery and would run for months. Roy Castillo had been back at work for a week in a modified capacity, carrying his shoulder carefully and making very dry jokes about the experience that Ethan suspected were his way of processing something that hadn't fully processed yet. Dale had asked Ethan, in a hallway conversation that was brief and direct in the way Dale did everything, whether the new job meant he was gone from the facilities team, and Ethan had said yes, and Dale had nodded once and said, "Good. You were wasted on the floors," which was the closest Dale came to a farewell, and also the closest he came to a compliment, and which somehow managed to be both. Ethan closed his laptop and turned off the kitchen light and stood in the dark apartment for a moment. He thought about Martinez. He thought about Okafor. He thought about the specific quality of silence that had accompanied him for 4 years. Not peaceful silence, but the silence of something that hasn't been said, a weight that doesn't get lighter just because you stop looking at it. He didn't know if this new work was reparation for anything. He was suspicious of the idea that it was, because he'd learned that narrative, the one where a man loses something and then finds a way to make meaning from the loss, was the story people told themselves because the alternative was harder to live with. He didn't trust the neatness of it. What he trusted was simpler. 41 people had gone home from Ashford Tower that night. Roy Castillo was going to keep his arm. Sophie was going to have her father at the breakfast table in the morning. That was enough to work with. He went to bed. And in the parking structure on Curtis Street, under 8 inches of new snow, the city of Denver moved through its ordinary night. Ambulances and delivery trucks and the first early morning commuters already warming their engines. While above it, Ashford Tower stood repaired and lit and waiting for the work week to begin again, carrying in its walls and floors and sealed maintenance corridors. The compressed memory of a night when an invisible man had made himself visible, and the people who'd needed him had lived. The federal trial of Adrian Wolfe began on a Tuesday in late April, 4 months after the night Ashford Tower burned. Denver had gone green by then, the kind of green that follows a hard winter with specific enthusiasm, like the city was overcompensating. The trees along the 16th Street Mall had budded early. The mountains to the west still held their snow, but the passes were open, and the air had that particular Rocky Mountain quality of being clean in a way that air in other cities isn't quite. And the courthouse where the proceedings began was full of people who had spent a winter waiting for this moment. Ethan testified on the 4th day. He'd been prepared by the federal prosecutors in 2 sessions that were thorough and professionally conducted, and that covered every minute of the night inside the building with the kind of granular attention that legal proceedings require, and that Ethan found both necessary and exhausting. He answered what was asked. He didn't embellish. He didn't minimize. When the defense attorneys pushed on points of sequence and timing, he corrected them when they were wrong and acknowledged uncertainty when he had it, because the one thing he'd learned in 15 years of missions with real stakes was that the most dangerous person in any high-pressure situation is the one who won't admit what they don't know. His military background came into the record. The classified designation stayed out of it. The federal prosecutors had worked with the relevant agencies to find a formulation that was accurate without being specific, and the result was that the court record described Ethan as a former Special Operations naval officer with classified service history, and left it there. The defense tried twice to push further, and twice the government objected and was sustained. He sat in the witness box for 3 hours on a Wednesday and answered questions about ventilation systems and elevator mechanics and fuel concentration levels and a server room on the 33rd floor, and when it was done, he walked out of the courthouse into the April sunlight and sat on the steps for 10 minutes before he felt like driving. A reporter tried to stop him on the way to his car. Young guy, early 30s, with the specific energy of someone who has been waiting outside a courthouse for 3 hours and has decided that energy will translate into access. "Mr. Drake, can you comment on your testimony? Sources inside say your actions that night were critical to—" "I don't have anything for you," Ethan said, and kept walking. "The public has a right to know the full story of what happened in that building." He stopped, turned around. The reporter held his recorder up, with the hopeful posture of someone who has learned that people stopping is 50% of the battle. "The full story," Ethan said, "is in the court record. Read it." He paused. "The people who matter already know what happened. They were there." He got in his car and drove to Sophie's school. The verdict came 6 weeks later. Guilty on all counts: securities fraud, criminal conspiracy, obstruction of justice, criminal sabotage, assault with a deadly weapon for the shot that hit Roy Castillo, and a collection of federal charges related to the deliberate disruption of emergency systems that the prosecutors had put considerable work into constructing, and that the jury had apparently found persuasive across the board. Wolf was sentenced to 22 years. Ethan heard about it from Victoria, who called him at 4 in the afternoon from somewhere that sounded like an outdoor space. He could hear wind. "It's done," she said. "I know. I saw." A pause. "How do you feel about it?" He thought about the question. He was in his office, a real office now, on the 14th floor of the temporary space that had become the semi-permanent executive annex while Ashford Tower finished its repairs. The office had a window that looked north toward the mountains, which he'd kept deliberately clear of anything that would block the view, not for aesthetic reasons, but because having something fixed and large to look at when a problem wasn't resolving was useful. "I feel like it's the right outcome," he said. "I feel like Roy Castillo is going to have a scar for the rest of his life that he didn't earn." "Yes, and I feel like 22 years doesn't give back the 4 years he spent building something inside your company that he had to burn down to protect." He paused. "I'm not saying he shouldn't be there. He should. I'm saying consequences existing doesn't mean the damage doesn't exist." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "He sent me a letter from the detention facility before the verdict. Handwritten." Ethan waited. "He said he was sorry," she said. "Not in a legal way. His attorneys would have been horrified. A real apology. He said he'd started managing the exposure because he genuinely believed he could contain it and protect the company, and that by the time he understood he couldn't contain it, he was so far inside it that the only move he could see was forward." She paused. "He said he knew that wasn't an excuse. He said he knew it in the first sentence." "Did it help?" Ethan said. A long pause. "A little," she said, "which makes me feel complicated things." "That's fair." "Is it? Feeling complicated things about a man who shot one of my employees and tried to kill you and me in a burning building? People aren't simple," he said. "Feeling complicated things about complicated people is just accuracy." She made the sound that meant she was sitting with something. Then, "I'm going to rebuild the capital allocation division. New leadership, new oversight structure, completely redesigned accountability systems." She paused. "It's going to take 2 years to do it right." "I know. I read the restructuring proposal." "You read the restructuring proposal. You sent it to the emergency operations team for the risk assessment portion." "I sent it for one section," she said, with the faint dry quality she'd developed over the past months of working together. "Not the whole thing." "It was an interesting read." She made a sound that was closer to genuine amusement than anything he'd heard from her in the courthouse weeks. "Ethan." "Victoria." "Thank you," she said. And then, because she was who she was. "For everything. Not just that night, for the past 4 months. For the assessment that upset everyone and was right. For the protocols that the facilities team actually uses because you built them with the facilities team instead of for them." A pause. "For being difficult when you needed to be." "I wasn't trying to be difficult," he said. "I know. That's what made it effective." He looked out the window at the mountains. A cloud was moving across the high ridgeline, the kind of cloud Sophie would have insisted on identifying by type and then drawing in her notebook, which she still carried everywhere. "Ask me again," he said. "About what?" "You asked me 4 months ago whether I regretted taking this job. You said to ask you in a year." "I said ask me in a year," he said, "but 4 months is enough." "And?" He sat with it honestly. The way things honest answers require, not the version that sounds good or the version that's easiest to say, but the version that's actually true when you strip away what you wish were true. "No," he said, "I don't regret it." She didn't say anything for a moment. He could still hear wind on her end. "Good," she said, simply. And then, "I'll see you Monday." "Monday?" he said, and they hung up. The repairs to Ashford Tower were completed in late June, 14 weeks after the fire. The reopening was not celebrated. Victoria had made that decision early and held to it, on the grounds that a celebration felt wrong given what the building had been through and what the people inside it had experienced, and that the best way to honor the return was to return and do the work. Ethan walked through the building on the Friday before the staff came back, alone with the new facilities director. a woman named Priya Mehta, who had come up through building engineering and who had an encyclopedic knowledge of the building's mechanical systems and no patience for anything that didn't have a practical purpose, qualities which Ethan found congenial. They went through every floor, every stairwell, every mechanical room and service corridor and ventilation access point. Priya narrated in her efficient, technical way what had been repaired, what had been replaced, what had been redesigned. The elevator mechanicals were new, the entire system rebuilt and fitted with independent monitoring circuits that would flag anomalies in real time to both building operations and an off-site security monitoring service. The ventilation had been reconfigured with hardware-level safeguards that couldn't be reversed remotely. The emergency communication system had been redesigned with triple redundancy and a hardened external relay that would function through virtually any internal disruption. The sub-basement service tunnel system was now separated from the generator fuel storage by a physical firewall that hadn't existed before, and that Ethan had specified in the second week of his job, before he'd known exactly how much he'd need it, and before the insurance assessors had been entirely convinced that the cost was justified. And he'd made the case until it was accepted because sometimes, something is necessary before you can fully explain why, and the job is to trust that knowledge and not wait for perfect articulation. They stood in the sub-basement engineering core, Dale Pritchard's territory, still smelling of machine oil and recycled air, the monitoring console updated and expanded, and currently showing every system in the building in real time on a screen that hadn't existed in January. "It's a better building," Priya said. "Yes," he agreed. "Safer. Safer than it was, not as safe as it could be." He looked at the console. "That's always going to be true. The goal is making the gap between where you are and where you could be as small as possible and being honest about where the gap still exists." Priya looked at him sideways. "You say things like that and people write them down. People shouldn't write them down. They should just do the work." "And yet," she said, and left it there. He thought about that as they went back up through the building, but the way things get attributed and quoted and turned into frameworks when the actual content of them is just experience, just the residue of having been in enough situations where the gap between what you knew and what you'd prepared for turned lethal. He didn't have a philosophy. He had a set of lessons that had cost people he cared about more than they should have cost, and the only thing he could do with that was build something that made the same lessons less necessary for the next person. That was what the emergency operations program was. Not heroism, not redemption, just the work of converting loss into something useful before it became only loss. The staff returned on Monday. 612 people filed back into Ashford Tower over the course of the morning, some of them visibly hesitant in the lobby, some of them moving with the deliberate normalcy of people who had decided in advance that they were going to be fine and were executing that decision through will alone. Ethan stood near the security desk for the first 2 hours, not doing anything in particular, just being present, because he'd learned that presence in the aftermath of something frightening is itself a form of information. It tells people that the people responsible for their safety are taking it seriously enough to show up. A woman stopped beside him around 9:30. He recognized her, Patricia Ortega, the facilities manager who had helped him move the accounting team off the 17th floor in January, steady at the rear while he led from the front. "First day back," she said. "How are you doing with it?" he said. She thought about it honestly, which he appreciated. "Okay. I keep expecting something to smell wrong." She paused. "Everything smells like new carpet and paint." "The 17th floor has new carpet," he said. "Smoke damage." "I know. I approved the installation." She was quiet for a moment. "I've been telling people it's fine, that it's just a building, but it doesn't fully feel like just a building yet." "That's normal," he said. "When does it start feeling normal again?" "I don't know," he said. "I've seen it go different ways for different people. Some of them, it's a few weeks. Some of them, it's longer." He paused. "If it gets to a point where it's affecting your work or you're not sleeping, there are resources through HR. Real ones, not the kind that exist on paper." She nodded. "You pushed for that." "The mental health support program?" "Yes." "I heard it was a fight." "Medium-sized fight," he said. "Worth having." She smiled, the small, real smile of someone who has been through something difficult and is finding their footing on the other side of it. "Thank you," she said, "for the 17th floor, that night." "You did well up there," he said. You were steady when it mattered. She looked at him for a moment. Then she went to the elevator and went up to the 17th floor and went back to work. Roy Castillo came back that same week, full duty, shoulder cleared by his surgeon, after 12 weeks of physical therapy that Roy had described in text to Ethan as the most boring experience of my adult life, which is saying something because I once sat through a 4-hour building compliance seminar. He walked into the engineering core on his first day back, set his coffee down on the console, and said to Dale, who was already at the panel, "Anything broken?" Dale said, "Not yet." "Give it time," Roy said, and they went to work. Ethan found out about the Roy and Dale exchange secondhand from Priya, who had witnessed it and reported it in the same neutral tone she used for everything. He filed it in the category of things that were quietly important. The way people who have been through something serious together find the path back to the ordinary, not by pretending the serious thing didn't happen, but by doing the next ordinary thing and then the one after that until ordinary is what surrounds them again. It took the whole of the summer. In July, Ethan took Sophie to the coast for a week. The Oregon coast, which she'd chosen off a map with the specific arbitrariness of a 7-year-old selecting a destination based primarily on the fact that Oregon was a word she liked the sound of. They stayed in a rental cabin outside Lincoln City that smelled like cedar and damp wool, and that had a deck 20 feet from where the beach grass began. And Sophie spent approximately 40% of her waking hours looking for specific rocks that she had decided she needed based on a rock classification guide she'd checked out of the school library. On the third evening, they sat on the deck after dinner and watched the light go out of the sky over the Pacific, and Sophie said, with the conversational directness that she'd apparently had since birth, "Are you happy?" He looked at her. She was 9 years old and somehow already asked the questions that adults spent years working up to. "Most of the time," he said, which was the honest answer. More than before. Before the new job? Before a lot of things. She thought about that, her feet dangling off the deck edge. "Mrs. Kowalski says you were a soldier." He'd known, abstractly, that this conversation was going to happen. He'd had an approximate plan for it, and the plan had dissolved the moment she said the word. "How does Mrs. Kowalski know that?" "She said she looked you up after the fire building thing." Sophie's tone was not accusatory, just factual. "She said she was worried and she wanted to know who I was with." "That's fair of her." "Were you?" "Was I what?" "A soldier." "Navy," he said. "Different branch. But yes, something like that." She was quiet for a moment, watching the last of the light. "Why didn't you tell me?" He thought about the real answer, not the version that protected her. She was 9, not 3, and she'd inherited from somewhere a capacity for straight information that made protective vagueness feel like disrespect. "Because I was trying to be done with it," he said, "and I thought if I didn't talk about it, being done would feel more real. Did it work?" "Not really," he said. "Because you're not done with it?" "Because being done with something and not talking about it are different things." He paused. "I was trying to make not talking do the work that being done with something has to do on its own. Those aren't the same." Sophie chewed on this. She had the quality, when processing something, of absolute stillness, like a computer running something large in the background. "So now you talk about it," she said. "A little more than before." "To the lady at work?" He looked at her. "Which lady?" "The one who calls sometimes, Victoria." She said the name with the careful neutrality of a child who has noticed something she's not sure she's allowed to have noticed. "Sometimes," he said. "She knew me when I was still trying to pretend I was done with it. That helps." "Because she knows both versions of you?" He looked at his daughter for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "That's exactly why." Sophie apparently found this satisfactory. She went back to watching the ocean. A wave broke on the rocks below the beach grass, and another. And the rhythm of it was the same rhythm that shorelines have always had and will keep having regardless of what happens above them. "I'm glad you're not pretending anymore," she said. Just that. Then she got up to go inside and find the rock book because she thought she'd seen something on the beach that afternoon that might be a specific kind of agate. He stayed on the deck for a while longer. The thing about grief, the specific kind of grief that comes from responsibility, from being the person in command when something goes wrong that leaves people dead, is that it doesn't resolve. He'd spent 4 years expecting it to resolve, treating it like a problem that had a solution if he could just find the right approach. And it didn't work because it wasn't that kind of problem. Martinez and Okafor were dead. The intelligence that had put them in the wrong place at the wrong time was false, and the person responsible for that false intelligence had been quietly disciplined in ways that the public record would never fully reflect. And that was the closest thing to justice the situation had produced. None of that changed what had happened. None of it ever would. What changed was what he did with what was left. And what was left was himself, imperfect, carrying weight that wouldn't fully lift, better at some things than others, a father who made bad pancakes, and a professional who argued with boards of directors, and a man who had chosen, after 4 years of hiding, to stand in a place where his experience meant something to people who needed it. That wasn't resolution. It was just a different relationship to the same facts. But a different relationship to the same facts turned out to be, in practice, a different life. He was still thinking about this when Victoria called the following Tuesday, back in Denver, in his office with the mountain view. She was calling about the Emergency Leadership Training Program, a proposal he'd put forward in May for a structured curriculum that would train building managers, facilities staff, and emergency coordinators across the company's entire real estate portfolio in crisis response protocols. Not just the what to do when the alarm sounds kind of training, the deeper kind, how to read a developing situation before it becomes a crisis, how to make decisions with incomplete information, how to communicate under pressure in ways that keep people functional rather than freezing them. It was ambitious, it was expensive, and it was, he'd argued in the proposal, the only version of emergency preparedness that had any chance of working in real conditions, because real conditions were never the ones you planned for specifically. They were the adjacent ones, the unexpected ones, the ones that shared features with what you'd practiced but differed in the details that mattered most. The board had approved it that morning. Modified. The first phase budget was smaller than he'd asked for, and the timeline was stretched from 18 months to 24, but approved, which was further than he'd expected it to get in the first review cycle. Congratulations, Victoria said on the phone, on a modified approval. On getting a $20 million safety program through a board that spent 20 years treating safety as a cost center. A pause. You want full credit? Argue about the modification. You want the program? Take the approval and build it. I'm going to take the approval, he said. I know, I just wanted to hear you say it. He almost smiled. When do we announce it? Friday. I want to tell the staff before we tell anyone external. She paused. That was your suggestion, 4 months ago. You said company news should reach the people inside the company before it reaches anyone outside. I remember saying it. It was a good suggestion, she said. I've been using it for everything since, partly because it's right, and partly because the staff noticed, and it changed something about how they trust the communications from the executive floor. She paused. Small things compound. They do, he said. That might be the one thing I've taken away from watching you work these past months, she said. Not the technical knowledge. I have people for technical knowledge. The understanding that small things compound, and that the small things most leaders treat as low priority because their small are exactly the things that determine whether the big things work. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the mountains had the particular late summer clarity they got when the air was dry. Sharp-edged, almost too detailed, like a photograph of themselves. Victoria, he said. Yes. I want to name the training program. A pause. After someone? After the facilities workers, the night shift staff, the people who stayed at consoles and moved groups through freight corridors and held doors and helped carry injured colleagues downstairs. He paused. Not after me. Not after a commander or an executive or anyone who was in a leadership role. After the people who did the work from the positions that get called support roles, which is a way of saying the roles that the whole structure depends on, but that the structure doesn't usually name. She was quiet for long enough that he thought the call had dropped. Yes, she said. What do you want to call it? He thought about Dale Pritchard at the monitoring console, staying when he could have left. Roy Castillo doing a sweep of a floor that didn't need to be swept at 10 at night in a blizzard because that was his job and his job mattered to him. Patricia Ortega steady at the back of a line of frightened people moving through smoke, making sure nobody fell behind. The foundation program, he said, because that's what they are, not the visible structure, the thing underneath it that holds everything else up. Another silence. That's good, she said. That's exactly right. The program launched the following spring. The announcement went to staff on a Thursday afternoon, and the response came back in the form of over 200 emails to Ethan's office over the following 48 hours. From facilities workers and administrative assistants and junior analysts and building engineers and security staff, a category of people who weren't usually in the position of receiving company communications that acknowledged them as the intended beneficiaries of something rather than the incidental audience for something aimed elsewhere. He read every email. He responded to as many as he could, briefly and specifically, because the specific response is the one that tells a person they were actually heard rather than collectively acknowledged. It took him most of a weekend. Sophie found him at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning with his laptop and his coffee and the particular focused expression she associated with his work, and she put her cereal bowl down and climbed into the chair across from him and ate her cereal and read her rock book, and didn't say anything, which was her version of keeping him company without interrupting, a quality he found extraordinarily considerate in a 9-year-old, and told her so periodically. After a while she said without looking up, "Are you writing to people from work?" "Yes." "Important people?" He looked at the email open on his screen. It was from a man named Jerome, who worked overnight security at the company's secondary office building in Aurora, who had written 4 sentences explaining that he had been in the job for 11 years, and that this was the first time he'd seen a company program where someone in management had acknowledged that the people who worked overnight were the ones who held the building together, and that he appreciated it. "Yeah," Ethan said, "important people." Sophie nodded and went back to her rock book. He sent Jerome a response that was 5 sentences long and specific about why overnight security staff were foundational to everything that happened in the buildings they guarded, and he meant every word of it, and he hoped Jerome could tell that he did. It was almost a year to the day from the night of the fire when the first cohort of the foundation program completed their certification. 42 people, facilities managers, building engineers, night security staff, emergency coordinators from 5 of the company's largest facilities, who had spent 6 months in a curriculum that covered crisis assessment, decision-making under pressure, emergency communication, and the specific, unglamorous work of keeping structures and the people in them functional when conditions were trying to make them not. The certification ceremony was not a ceremony in the traditional sense. No stage, no speeches, no awards handed across a podium. Ethan had specifically designed it as a working session, a final practical assessment run as a scenario exercise in Ashford Tower itself, using the actual building systems and actual emergency protocols in a live drill that was as close to real conditions as they could manufacture without actually setting anything on fire. Every one of the 42 passed. Afterward, they gathered in the 14th floor conference room with coffee and the kind of subdued satisfaction that comes not from being celebrated but from having done something hard and knowing you did it. Victoria was there, and Priya, and Dale, who had agreed to serve as a subject matter consultant for the technical modules, and who had done so with characteristic efficiency and zero sentimentality. Ethan stood at the front of the room and looked at the 42 people and thought about what he wanted to say, which had been a problem he'd been sitting with for 3 weeks and hadn't fully solved. He said, "The thing I want you to remember is that none of what you learned in this program is about being extraordinary. It's about being prepared enough that when something ordinary goes wrong, and things go wrong, that's not pessimism. That's just how buildings and organizations and people work. You know what to do with the next 60 seconds. He paused. 60 seconds is usually the difference, not because everything gets resolved in 60 seconds, but because 60 seconds of the right action at the right moment changes the shape of everything that follows. He looked around the room. You have that now. That's what we built here. That was all he had. It wasn't much as speeches go. But Dale nodded once from the back of the room, which from Dale was the equivalent of a standing ovation, and Patricia Ortega, who was in the second row, was looking at him with the expression of someone who recognized the truth in something because they'd lived adjacent to it. Victoria walked beside him afterward, in the hallway outside the conference room, both of them carrying the dregs of conference coffee in paper cups. No grand statement, she said. I said what I had. 60 seconds. It's true. I know it's true. She was quiet for a moment. A year ago, I was standing in a hallway full of smoke, watching a man in a janitor's uniform tell my security chief which stairwell to use. You were also barefoot, he said. I was also barefoot. She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. They were standing at the window at the end of the hallway, the same floor he'd first come up to on the night of the fire, and the view was north toward the mountains, the same view he had from his office. "Do you ever think about who you were that night, before everything came out?" He thought about it. The faded gray uniform. The 14 months of deliberate invisibility. The careful maintenance of a life that asked nothing of him beyond the physical and the routine. "Sometimes," he said. "Do you miss it?" He surprised himself by genuinely considering the question rather than dismissing it, because there had been something real in that invisibility. Not the peace he'd been trying to manufacture, but the simplicity of a life with narrow scope and no expectation. He'd been hiding, yes, but the hiding had also given him Sophie's school pickups and bad Saturday pancakes and 14 months of learning a building from the inside out, and that knowledge had been, in the end, the thing that kept 41 people alive. "No," he said, "but I understand why I wanted it." What changed? He looked out at the mountains. The high peaks were already showing early snow, September, and the season turning again. "Someone needed what I knew," he said, "and I was there. And it turned out that hiding what you know doesn't make it less heavy. It just means you're carrying it without getting anything useful done with it." He paused. "That's not a philosophy. That's just what happened." She nodded. She was looking at the mountains too. "My father built this company from 11 employees," she said. "He was not a good person to work for by most accounts. Demanding in ways that weren't always proportionate, not great at hearing bad news, convinced that the structure he'd built was correct because it had worked so far." She paused. "He died thinking the company would outlast everything. That's probably the closest thing to a faith he had." She was quiet for a moment. "I've been trying to figure out for 3 years what I want it to be instead. What I want to build that's different from what he built while keeping the parts of it that were worth keeping." And I think the answer is something like what you said in there, something where the people holding the building up aren't invisible. She turned from the window. "I don't know if I'll get it right. I don't think my father ever thought about whether he was getting it right, just whether it was working. I'm trying to ask a different question and I don't always know where it leads." "That's the right question to be asking," he said. "Even if you don't know the answer?" "Especially then." She looked at him. There was something in her expression that he'd come to recognize over the past year. The particular quality of a person who is used to being the smartest and most capable person in most rooms, and has found, in the specific dynamic of this particular working relationship, someone she could be uncertain in front of without it costing her anything. He found he valued that too, more than he'd expected to. "Monday," she said. "Monday," he agreed. She went back toward her office, and he stood at the window for another minute before going back to his own. The maintenance room on the 14th floor still had the faded gray uniform hanging inside it. He'd put it there himself, deliberately, when he'd moved into the permanent office space, and when Priya had asked what it was doing there, he'd said it belonged to the building, and she'd looked at him with the expression she used for things she found impractical but didn't have the energy to argue about, and it had stayed. He passed the maintenance room door on his way back to his office. He didn't stop. He didn't look at the uniform. He didn't need to. It was enough to know it was there. That specific reminder of the man who had pushed a mop through marble corridors at midnight and watched and listened and learned a building the way you learn something you might someday need, not knowing when the moment would come, only knowing that preparation without certainty was the only kind available, and that it was, in the end, enough. Sophie asked him once, much later, what he thought about when things got hard at work. She asked it the way she asked most things, directly, during dinner, as though the question had simply arrived and she saw no reason to delay it. He said, "I think about what the next 60 seconds need." She considered this. "And then after 60 seconds? Then you think about the next 60 seconds after that." She nodded, apparently finding this operationally sound. "And it works?" "Well enough," he said, "most of the time." "What about the times it doesn't?" He looked at his daughter across the dinner table, 9 years old, sharp-eyed, carrying a rock book under her arm even at the dinner table because she was always in the middle of something. The daughter who had decided early and without apparent effort to simply accept her father as the complete, imperfect, occasionally unknowable person he was, which was more than most people managed for each other. "The times it doesn't," he said, "you ask for help." She nodded again. "Hey," she said, and went back to her dinner. Outside, Denver was moving into autumn, the particular amber season of high-altitude cities, where the light comes in at an angle that makes everything look like it's being seen for the last time before something changes. The aspens in the mountain parks had already gone gold. The blizzard season was months away. And on the 14th floor of Ashford Tower, behind a maintenance room door that nobody opened much anymore, a faded gray janitor's uniform hung in the dark. The daily uniform of a man who had hidden himself inside ordinary work and learned, in that hiding, everything he would later need. Not the story of a hero, not a story about extraordinary men doing extraordinary things. Just a man who knew a building and was there when it mattered and did the next thing that needed doing. That was all. That was enough.